It is truly an honour to be here this evening. First of all, I do want to congratulate the Vincent Fellows who were graduating this evening. This is an extraordinary, it's an extraordinary course. I had a look at the course details before I came up here this evening and was really incredibly impressed and actually quite humbled and intimidated by some of the thinkers, some of the leaders, the business leaders that we have here this evening. And I'm also really quite envious of the course that you guys have done. I think it says a lot about the program and its principles that such an extraordinary group of figures from academia, from the civil service, business, media, the military have all decided that it's worth investing time and energy in. And I really don't mind admitting that I do, as I said, feel not just intimidated but also humbled to be standing before such an extraordinary, eminent group. Now, I know that in the course of my job I've often faced some pretty difficult ethical questions of my own, and I don't think that journalists and our employers pay anywhere near enough attention to the kinds of tools that this fellowship provides. And in fact, I'm very pleased to see someone from the ABC represented here, and I hope that many other media leaders, many other people from the ABC follow this through, because I think we don't, as an industry, necessarily have the kinds of institutionalized tools to deal with some of the ethical challenges that we face on a routine basis, on a daily basis. But I have had a bit of experience of some of the practical effects of ethical problems in my own business and the kinds of problems we often encounter, and there are a few things that I would like to touch on here this evening. Now, I know that in broad terms, we journalists are a fairly despised bunch of characters. Yes, I heard that titter. On most of the scales that measure public respect for various professions, we rank somewhere around the used car salesmen and pornographers. We're seen as gossip mongers, as salesmen of sleaze, and as hopelessly biased purveyors of opinion rather than the objective reporters that most people believe we ought to be. I'll come to the broader ethical elements of that a little later, but for now, I hope you'll forgive me if I indulge myself for a moment and tell you that in a very direct way, I feel convinced that I wouldn't be standing here before you if it weren't for the fact that all of us involved in our case, and I'm talking about myself, Muhammad Fahmy and Beha Muhammad, had held to our highest moral and ethical standards throughout our careers. As you know, we were accused of supporting a terrorist organisation. The Egyptian investigators alleged that we'd used our role as reporters to work as propagandists for the Muslim Brotherhood. It's a characterization that I think a lot of people wouldn't have been too surprised by, that have seen it as perfectly consistent with the way that they understand that a lot of journalists tend to operate. But as the facts began to unfold, an extraordinary groundswell of support emerged. It began with our professional colleagues, including some of our fiercest rivals. Hundreds of people from organisations like CNN, the BBC, the ABC included, stood with their mouths taped shut, holding signs declaring free AJ staff. And remember, this is in a fiercely competitive industry where we would rather eat our own babies than acknowledge the opposition. And then came the public, first in the hundreds, then the thousands, then the millions, then the tens of millions. The free AJ staff hashtag received almost 3 billion impressions on Twitter, and that is a truly extraordinary number by any measure. Although, I've got to be honest, to be fair, a good billion of those impressions were probably due to my family members. In Cairo, there were a lot of layers of concrete between us and the outside world, but I have to tell you that we really did feel the weight of that extraordinary public support. And then came the politicians. They lined up behind us with an incredible unanimity that is genuinely rare in these days of partisanship and point scoring. And as Professor Wood just mentioned, I do feel genuinely proud and very honoured to have that unanimous Senate resolution, that Senate motion that was passed today. I think it means a lot to me in particular because it reflects, I think, a commitment to not just what we went through as individuals, but what we came to represent. And that is the issues of freedom of speech, due process, freedom of the press, and so on. Now, the point that I'm trying to make is that the vast support emerged because everyone came to understand that we had always remained true to our highest ethical standards, and not just in our reporting of Egypt, but throughout our careers. If any of us had lapsed at any point, if we'd somehow given in to the more base instincts of our profession, if we'd been sloppy with the facts, if we'd been biased or inaccurate at any point, our critics in Egypt would have jumped on those stories with glee. They'd have shouted them from the rooftops. Nobody, our colleagues, our public, our supporters, the politicians would have had confidence in us. They would have doubted our own integrity. They would have suspected that perhaps maybe there was something in the allegations, and frankly I think our support would have crumbled to dust. So in a very real way, and I hope I'm not overstating the case here, but I really do feel that our ethics in this particular case really did save us. I'm telling you this story partly to make a point about ethics that I know is really pretty redundant with this audience, but also because for all the cynicism about journalism and the media in general, there is an understanding amongst the public that we do in fact perform a pretty important function in the way that our societies work. People know that for all the criticism that gets levelled at the media, democracy doesn't work unless there is a free exchange of ideas and information and a watchdog keeping track of those who'd make decisions in our name. People generally backed us, partly out of outrage, as I said, because of what we were going through at a personal level, but because of what we came to understand, what we came to represent. People might not always like what they see in the media, but they still recognise its need and they value it for the best of what it produces. Now that's the good news, and this is where I start to think we run into some problems. I think journalism is, at the moment, in quite a serious crisis. I keep catching Kate Tawney's eye from the BBC, Director of News at the BBC, and I know this is very much an ongoing debate throughout the industry. Let's see if we can nut out some of these problems. I know that change is a part of life, but I worry that the technological, social and political shifts we're seeing in the media have pushed it into the greatest period of change since the invention of the printing press. And although I've got some thoughts on what we ought to do about it, I'm not at all convinced that the changes are for the best or that we have any real clear solutions. Now let's go back to Democracy 101 for a moment. The role that journalism is supposed to play. Again, forgive me if I'm preaching to the converted, or we've all been through this before, but let's go through it now. In the classical model, the media is the fourth estate, where the eyes, the ears, and sometimes the very potty mouth of the public, and it's the watchdog that keeps track of those other three pillars of society, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Now, as I'm sure everyone here well knows, in theory, a functioning democracy demands a well-informed public capable of debating the issues. It also needs to be able to reach a consensus, and our job is to be, well, the medium, the place where information is exchanged and those debates take place. To do that, we need a genuinely independent media that has the resources, the skills, and the legal freedom necessary to interrogate the government and hold it to account, and not simply to transmit information, but to analyse and present it in context and in a way that makes it relevant to the public. But that can't happen if the press is under attack in the way that I believe it is now. Globally, press freedom is in its worst state since advocacy groups started measuring it. Rarely have so many of us been imprisoned, beaten up, intimidated or murdered in the course of our duties. According to a count by the Committee to Protect Journalists, last year 60 were killed on the job or because of their work. Now that number is down slightly from 70 the previous year, but over the past 3 years, it's the worst it's been since the CPJ began keeping records in 1991. And here's a statistic that obviously interests me. At the end of last year, the number of journalists imprisoned for their work stood at 220, with China, Iran, Eritrea, and Egypt all topping the list of jailers. Another group, Freedom House, has produced a map that charts press freedom across the world. Purple marks the countries where the press is not free, and there's a vast stain that spreads across Asia, the Middle East, down into northern, central and southern Africa. The yellow patches that mark a partly free press spread across most of Latin America, West Africa, East Africa and a few corners of Southeast Asia. The green patches denoting a free press lie over Western Europe, North America and thankfully Australasia. But depressingly, Freedom House reckons those green bits only cover 14% of the world's population. And it's shrinking. Now here's one more statistic that has me worried. Of those journalists sitting in prison, about 2/3 of them are there on anti-state charges such as subversion or terrorism, just as the three of us were in Egypt. That fact is troubling because it seems to confirm what I've suspected for a while now, that the atrociously named war on terror is itself a very serious part of the problem. Throughout most of the past 4 decades, wars have been dominated by struggles over tangible things like territory or resources or ethnicity. And those of us who've covered conflicts, the messy conflicts, the local conflicts like Afghanistan before 9/11 or other local wars such as the battle for resources in eastern Congo or political and ethnic power in South Sudan, as I've done, will know that the biggest risk generally comes from random bits of metal that are flying around or a drunk soldier at a checkpoint rather than any attack specifically aimed at journalists. It's risky, of course, but the dangers are usually incidental rather than from any particular hostile attack directly aimed at journalists. Now, of course, propaganda is as old as war itself, and warring factions have always sought to control the narrative of a conflict. But in those wars over stuff, the target has generally been the message rather than the messenger. And this brings me back to the war on terror, a conflict that by its very nature is indefinable. There's no clear physical or ideological boundaries and a title that means everything or nothing. Or rather, it means what any of the groups involved wanted to mean. This is, in a way that we haven't seen for a generation, a struggle over an ism. It's a battle between competing worldviews, much more than a fight for land or minerals. And in this struggle, the message is as much a weapon as any gun. Witness the way that Islamic State has used YouTube and Twitter to recruit its supporters and terrify its opponents. Now, the trouble for us journalists is that in this conflict, there is no middle ground, no neutral turf, no safe place from which we can report. And as much as we abhor and condemn the executions by Islamic State of the American journalists James Foley and Stephen Sotloff, or the attack on the Charlie Hebdo office in Paris, I'm afraid it was George W. Bush who set the ground rules in the wake of 9/11 when he declared that you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. That single statement made it impossible for reporters to hold to the principles of balance and fairness without being accused of being agents acting for the enemy. Since the war on terror began, governments across the globe have used the T word to excuse all manner of attacks on human rights and press freedoms. It almost feels like a kind of globalized McCarthyism where simply invoking terrorism is enough in some cases to literally get away with murder. Now, I don't mean to minimize the risks of terrorism or blame governments alone. Clearly, terrorism is an extraordinary problem in today's world, and the Islamic State's executions and abuses are simply the latest and most shocking examples of the problem on the other side of the ledger. But in this new world, to simply ask questions about the conflict or to seriously investigate either extremism or the government's handling of it, you make yourself a target. And in the view of both sides, if you cross the line in pursuit of our most fundamental principles of balance, of fairness and of accuracy, you effectively join the enemy. What that has done, in other words, is make the media the battleground. It's a chilling redefinition of Marshall McLuhan's famous phrase, "The medium is the message." Now, for me, this is personal. As you know, I recently came out of 400 days in prison for collaborating with Islamic extremists, something that has frankly often struck me as quite tragic and tragically ironic after extremist Islamists gunned down my own producer, Kate Payton, as we worked together in Mogadishu in 2005. Now, in prison, I often thought about what we'd done to upset the government. In a way, I mightn't have minded quite so much if we'd genuinely pushed the boundaries. I've done plenty of that in my time in other places, where my own radar was much more finely tuned, where I was far more aware of where those boundaries lay, of what might upset a government or a warlord, of what their response might be, and of what I could get away with. But in Egypt, we quite deliberately played with a straight bat. I'd only been there for a couple of weeks before our arrest, so I really wasn't in any position to probe the edges. I was simply treading water. My work was, I'd have to admit, rather routine, and it was certainly nothing special. But Egypt is one of the most polarised places I've ever been that isn't locked in civil war. Remember that barely 6 months before our arrest, the Muslim Brotherhood had formed the first legitimately elected government in the nation's history. They remain the single largest and best organised political force in the country, so in the pursuit of balance and fairness, it made sense for us to pick up the phone and talk to them. It seems that act alone made us targets of the government. Now, I'm not going to suggest here that Australia is anywhere near that situation, and in fact, every time I come home, I'm struck by how extraordinarily lucky we are on just about every level imaginable. But what concerns me is that in the debate about the balance between security and civil rights, we run the real risk of losing those things that have genuinely helped keep our society safe, stable, and truly free. The Australian Human Rights Commission's President Gillian Triggs, of course, recently rolled a grenade into the middle of that debate when she warned that counter-terrorism laws have been introduced with what she called unseemly haste, and said that they're likely to have a chilling effect on free speech and privacy. Now, whatever your views of Gillian Triggs might be, I think it's unfortunate that the debate has focused on her supposed politics rather than the substance of her concerns. Although I have to confess that I do happen to agree with her here, my point is that we need a genuine, open debate that considers the trade-off between security on the one hand and freedom of the press on the other. If we really want the kind of legislation with all the restrictions that the government is proposing, we have to do it fully aware that we are going to sacrifice freedoms that I believe have helped create the open society that we live in now. Now, in my work in some more authoritarian places, I've often noticed that in the relationship between government and the media, there seems to be a sliding scale that defines the way that power is distributed. If you take power from one, you tend to give it to the other. In the current environment, it is all too easy, too tempting for governments to use the war on terror as a convenient excuse for dragging the slider to the right, to claim more power in the interests of national security, trading off freedom of speech and the media's oversight role in the process. Now, in my view, if we were content to live in a police state, let me rephrase that. In my view, even if we were content to live in a police state, history suggests that we can never really deal with terrorism simply by screwing down on security. Fighting fire with fire only tends to burn the whole place down. Now, after working in some of the most draconian and restricted societies in the world, I'm convinced that the best way to tackle extremism of any sort is to keep an open and accountable society with the media free to do its job, interrogating not just governments, but those whose opinions tend to drift off into the political extremes. And this brings me to the second big challenge to journalism. And in this one, I don't think anyone is to blame. Nobody's doing anything particularly sinister or cynical. No legislation is at fault. No political or business figures are working to undermine or weaken the media. It is simply an unintended but inevitable consequence of the unstoppable digital revolution. The problems start with the collapse of the old business model. This isn't any news, of course. We've all heard about how newspaper circulations have crashed, about how more and more people are getting their news from social media or aggregated sites like Google or Twitter. They watch TV on YouTube or Netflix. I'm not here to deliver a business lecture, but the point is that where once news organisations were able to pay good money to keep their most talented staff, now anybody with experience is being laid off. Two of my closest friends in the business have both been recently made redundant. One was one of the ABC's most experienced and, in my view, one of its most talented current affairs producers, and the other one of its finest foreign correspondents. The former correspondent was rather pointedly told that his salary could pay for 2 or 3 reporters fresh out of college and with much faster thumbs. It's true, I'm afraid. So not only are we losing the journalists with experience and deep knowledge, the ones who would have been the icons for the next generation, but we're sacrificing editorial wisdom for technological skill. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this is... I don't want to feel as I'm pointing the finger here, but it's something that I understand, and I understand from a very personal point of view, and I've been at the very sharp end of this, and I'll come to that in a moment. The problem is the skill that employers are looking for is just that. It's technological rather than craft. And what I mean here is the ability to operate the new equipment quickly and deliver content, rather than develop the kinds of artistic and professional analytical skills and abilities that used to be prized so highly. Let me give you an example. In the old days when cameramen with equipment worth $60,000 or $80,000, they needed a separate assistant to lug the kit and then record the sound, and the training was a very serious business. Photographers and radio reporters all lugged heavy and sophisticated and expensive equipment that demanded real expertise to operate. And with that came the highly developed craft skills. Now, I'm not suggesting we wind the clock back to go back to those old days of lugging heavy, expensive equipment, but here's the effect that it's had. It's degraded the intimate understanding, the intimate relationship that the craftsman had with the medium. If you had spent a lifetime working with cameras to understand and operate a camera, you understood the way that pictures worked. You had a very close, deep and intimate understanding, an intimate relationship with those pictures. As a sound recordist, you understood sound. As a photographer, you really understood the way that pictures worked. And you were able to use those skills to communicate far more deeply than words alone could do. That's the very best of our craft. But at the moment, what the digital revolution has done is collapse all of those jobs into a smartphone. Just a couple of days ago, I saw a new innovation that Sky has introduced. It's a kind of iPhone selfie stick that they call the Smart Grip. It's a little grip that holds an iPhone in the side of it. It has an external microphone attached to it so that reporters can film themselves doing live crosses. Now, for me as a professional journalist, this is a terrifying thing. I know there are plenty of people who see this as a liberating thing. It allows reporters to get into the middle of a story. It allows them a sense of immediacy. It gives them things that we call intimacy with the story, intimacy with your audiences. But from a practical point of view, from a professional, analytical, journalistic point of view, what it does is it forces you to get on air. It means that you don't have the technologically mandated limits to the things that you can do in a day, which means as a journalist, while the cameraman was setting things up, you would have the time to go and talk to people, you'd have a chance to interview people, to talk to people off the record, to sit down. You would have one or two live crosses to do through the day, one or two programs to hit, and you'd have a chance to understand and build a relationship with the story. Now, literally, and I'm not kidding, literally within 10 minutes of arriving, you're expected to be on air. Now I know I'm starting to sound like a grumpy old Luddite, pining for the old days when we used to deliver the news by courier pigeon. But I was at the forefront of the multi-skilled revolution. For about 5 or 6 years, I worked in Africa as the video journalist for the BBC, reporting from some of the world's most volatile corners on my own. I worked across South Sudan, Kenya, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Rwanda, even Somalia. I lugged my own stills camera, my video camera, my radio recorder, and my notebook. And I remember sitting in a bunker with some government troops in South Sudan trying to film cursing as I dropped my batteries and my sound kit into the mud while I was trying to film the battle. And yet I was still able to produce sound-rich radio news and current affairs features and edited television packages and online photo galleries and written analyses, and I was good at it. But through it all, I learned just how much of the journalism skills we've had to sacrifice for the sake of filling the digital void with cheap content. We call it journalism. And I know that the journalists in the audience will wince. I can see you, Kate, smiling at that one. Yes, it's something we always moan about. We keep complaining about it to our editors. Whether we like it or not, this is the way the business is moving. Now, I left the BBC because I couldn't cope with that anymore. I couldn't deal with it financially because the money was drying up. We were being forced to do stories cheaper and cheaper, more and more content, my ability to understand the stories that I was doing was being sacrificed because I had to spend all of my intellectual energy on simply managing the bits of kit and producing the stories. There was one story I did for the BBC in southern Somalia that involved a trip down the Omo River to do a story on this colossal dam that was being built. It was an important story, a very important story. And I think the journalism was good, but I had to produce, to get this done, to cover the budget, you had to spread the content amongst as many news outlets as you could. I ended up doing 18 different versions of that story. Online video diaries, television news features, television news stories, radio diaries, radio news stories, radio documentaries, online photo galleries, audio diaries. It was extraordinary, 18 different versions, and I tell you, by the end of it, none of that material was particularly good, and I don't think it worked as well as anywhere near the way that it could have and should have done if I'd been able to do the journalism properly. Now, as I said, I don't think this is anyone's fault. I'm not blaming the news proprietors or the editors or the inventors of the technology. It has simply been an inevitable consequence of the way the technology has developed. We might have won something with the speed of news delivery and cheap content for consumers across a vast range of sources, but here's what we've lost in the process. The demand for speed has cost us context. Gone is the time to check the facts. Gone is the time to ask a follow-up question. The time to dig into the history of a story and weed out some relevant research that could challenge the narrative that we might be getting from a politician. Instead of feeding our democracy on a healthy diet of fruit and vegetables and the occasional meal of red political meat, we're stuffing it full of soft drink and potato crisps. There is precious little time or money for investigations. Foreign news, obviously something that's very close to my heart, but always a tough sell, is being relegated to the margins, with reporting left mostly to the agencies. It's both expensive and unpopular, but in our increasingly globalised world, we're losing our own Australian eyes and ears, watching what's happening beyond our own borders. Of course, there is a need to bring in young, fresh talent, and there is a lot about the new digital world to celebrate, but unless something unexpected emerges out of this technological maelstrom, I'm afraid that we're well on the way to losing the craft, skills and experience that have, until now, done a pretty good job of keeping a healthy flow of information and analysis pumping through our democracy's veins. Now, quite apart from worrying about the impact that this is having on democracy, I also think this is costing us something perhaps just as vital, and this is the trust and the confidence of the public that we serve. As I mentioned at the start of the speech, the media has always had a rather conflicted relationship with the public. People seem to consume the work we produce with an ever-increasing appetite, but they also seem to grumble about that work in equal measures. If they were cynical in the past, I think the loss of focus over both editorial standards and the technical quality of the work we produce is making it much harder to win the arguments with the government that we were talking about earlier. This is, in a very real sense, a battle for our own survival. If we're ever going to win the debate over the freedom of the press, we need the public trust. We need the public behind us. We need people to acknowledge the vital role that the press plays and to demand that it be fiercely protected. We need them to believe that the media is worth defending for its own sake. And you might have thought that's a given, but what's become clear to me in watching the argument over Gillian Trigg's remarks is the debate over the impact of the government's legislation on media freedom really hasn't happened. At the very least, we need the public to demand to know the impact of security legislation on the media's ability to interrogate the government and report freely, so that we fully understand what it is we're getting into before this legislation becomes law. I'm not convinced that we will ever get the public response that we need if people are cynical about our motives and our ethics in the first place. Ladies and gentlemen, we can't roll back the technological clock, and we can't magic public trust just because we want it. There is a very good chance that my worries over the future of the media are misplaced, and that any one of a multitude of new media models will give us both the quality that we need and the funding that can pay for it. But I don't think we can simply allow ourselves to be washed along with the technological tide and trust that it'll all work out in the end. We can't legislate the gadgetry, and I'm not a Luddite at all, but I think we need to make some conscious decisions that will give us a source of news that is financially independent, flexible enough to absorb whatever digital advances come along, and that's genuinely free of either political or business pressures. At the moment, the only media organisation able to take the high ground in news are those, the only media organisations, plural rather, that are able to take the high ground in news are those that are financed by benefactors who are in it for reasons other than business. They're either wealthy oligarchs like Alexander Lebedev, who bought 4 British newspapers, including The Independent and The Evening Standard. He's in it because he liked the prestige of owning a quality newspaper. Or there are businessmen like Rupert Murdoch, who keep the Times going in the UK as a lost leader for his other ventures. Or governments like Qatar, who finance Al Jazeera as a form of soft power. Either way, profit is not a part of the equation. Now, in Australia, I think the ABC is supposed to fill that role, but its funding model is, I think, far too exposed to political pressure to do it effectively. The ABC is trying to do far too much with too little, and it's constantly being threatened with further cuts. Now, I know the ABC, I know Kate Tawny's here, and I'm not going to look for a job with this, but I am convinced that if we're going to have not just a national broadcaster, but one of the world's best news providers, we need a substantial source of money that's ring-fenced and independent of central revenue. The money needs to be enough that the ABC can afford to produce journalism of the highest standards without worrying about whether it attracts audiences. Its priority must be to set a gold standard for ethics, standards and integrity. It must be ruthlessly sceptical and independent, with a focus not just on filling that yawning digital void with stuff, but filling it with great storytelling. Again, I know that's right out of the ABC's playbook, but I think the pressures that it's under is placing enormous restrictions on it. I do have an idea. It may not work, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. The British licence fee for anyone who owns a television set is great in principle. The BBC has a reliable source of revenue that the government isn't directly involved in, and the public pays on the understanding that it is an essential part of British cultural, political and social life, even if not everybody consumes it. But the licence fee is clearly outdated, and almost certainly it's going to be axed in an environment where fewer and fewer people actually own TV sets, preferring to stream video on their computers. Instead, I reckon something like a tax on data is worth considering. Perhaps a couple of cents a gigabyte, something that would be clearly marked on people's data plans. They'd know exactly what they're paying for, and the ABC would be encouraged to produce online content that Australians would want to consume in return. It might not be the best solution, certainly it isn't the only solution, but somewhere along the line, and this is my point, that we need to find a way of creating a place where journalism can flourish for its own sake, rather than allowing the news business to be washed along by those technological and political tides. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.